My name is Mark Johnson, and I'm presenting a paper that I wrote for Dr. Gubble's class. It's Enlightenment Ideas and Theory in World Literature. So, I'd like to just start out with a little bit of an introduction to what my paper deals with and the Enlightenment era and the scientific revolution. So the Enlightenment era and the scientific revolution took place in the 17th and 18th century. It's characterized by a growth in reason-centered thought and major scientific discoveries, names that we typically associate with the Enlightenment era: Locke, Hume, Descartes, Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Galileo. So that's kind of the associations of like what the paper and the time era deals with. And specifically, the two works of literature that my paper is about is Don Quijote by Miguel de Cervantes, written in, or first published in 1605, and Paradise Lost by John Milton, first published in 1667. And the paper is about how they relate to the two philosophies of empiricism and subjective relativity. And then it ties in the empiricism and subjective relativity to Galileo and the Copernican revolution, to like the heliocentric universe or solar system and the telescope. And then also give it a little bit of significance in today in our lives, because I think a lot of these theories are not just tied into literature and science, but like how we just view the world. So lots of good stuff. Just a brief summary of Don Quixote for a refresher if you can't remember from high school. A short summary: it's about a kind of down-and-out nobleman who has romanticized these Arthurian legends, and then he goes and tries to apply them in real life, and he suffers disastrous consequences. I think the most memorable one is the charging down the windmills that he thinks are giants. And then empiricism, just defined in my own words, it's a theory that all knowledge originates from experience. So everything that we know comes from the real world. There's not, it's universal to everybody. So where do we see this in Don Quixote? The whole book, or the whole novel, it critiques attaching greater dogmatic meaning to the fictional narrative works. And as far as like how that relates to the empiricism, he subscribes to the Arthurian legends, right? And it's kind of the reverse of like somebody who takes a pure empirical standpoint and then he fails. So it like critiques relativity in order to show that empiricism is correct. So he has like this subjective relative view of reality. He goes and he like, sees a windmill, and not based off of anything that's real, he goes and thinks it's a giant and like charges it down. And it's just, saying that like not what you think doesn't make a difference on reality. It's completely empirical. It's what it is what it is. And then the structure of the novel is also Cervantes' own, I guess, critique on just literature from that perspective, because he writes it as a biography. So it's not presented as just a story. It's presented as the real life occurrences of Don Quixote. And people at the time were like so convinced of this that they like went out and thought that the real Don Quixote was wandering around. So it's supposed to be like evidence of this empirical standpoint being true. So how do we see this, and how does it relate to literary theory? Textualism. So think of the United States Constitution. So like the empirical version, empiricism in literary theory is textualism. So when we think of the United States Constitution, the words are set in stone. There's no like implications, or it's supposed to be explicit. You read the words and that's what it means. And how we see this in Don Quixote is that there's only one correct way to understand the literary work, and that's again with the biography, the stories of Arthurian legend. He thinks they're supposed to be taken literally. The text claims they're not, and it's supposed to be like there's only one meaning from things that you can draw from work. So we're going to set that aside and focus on Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, it's an epic poem written by John Milton in 1667, I think I said. And it's all about the alternative happening of the Genesis story from the Bible. It's told from this perspective of Satan and his fallen angels. And it creates this alternative view of heaven and God as not like divine and great and everything, but from Satan and his fallen angels' perspective, where they don't think he's all that great. An excerpt that serves as a good example of this is one of the fallen angels, Beelzebub, kind of a funny sounding name, but he gives this example of how if there were no hell and the alternate perspective of Satan and his fallen angels, that then there wouldn't be, like, all that heaven would just be this monolithic occurrence of just one thing. So there is no bad, there is no evil, you're just forced into servitude for the rest of your life, and there's nothing good about that. And so it's saying that there isn't just this one standpoint, there's a relative take on this, and that's the Paradise Lost. And it's John Milton. We see this in literary theory with the reader-centered approach. So there's a real famous paper by Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, and it's all about how the author's intention doesn't really mean much. So like in the case of the Bible and the Genesis story, like it's intended to be, God is great, here are all these things that you should do, and this is why Satan is evil. But what John Milton is doing is like, well, hey, that's definitely not the case. There's this alternative viewpoint to the way that things are happening, and Roland Barthes, I think, would definitely agree with that, is like John Milton has his own perspective on how these things are happening. In literary theory, this is known as new criticism. So neither one is necessarily, like, there's not like this purely relative stance. Like, obviously, there seems to be a universal message taken from the Bible or even these works, but it's also definitely subject to your own personal interpretation. So neither theory is correct. It's a synthesis of the both that is really like modern literary theory. And this is a big deal for me as like an emerging literature student, is because I think you get a lot of backlash with like when you're presenting this, is students want to like, you know, what does this mean? Well, it can kind of mean whatever you want to based off of the text. And so when I was reading these works, it was kind of like an aha moment in my mind where it clicked. This is a real illustration of like, this isn't a debate that just goes on in literature. It's a debate that goes on in real life with how we choose to interpret the world. It's not just whatever you think about it, but there's no set defined meaning to things. And this was kind of more of an existential dilemma at the time that these works were being written, with the Copernican revolution and Galileo and the telescope, because you have this empirical world where you look up at the sky and you see the sun moving around the earth, the stars moving around the earth, and it appears with empirical evidence that that's the way things are. But then you bring in this relative viewpoint of strange device where you look up at the sky and then use calculus to prove that it's actually not the earth at the center, it's the sun. And so at the time, I think these works are reflective of people coping with that, and like this viewpoint in conjunction with the philosophy that it's a unison of the two. So implications for the modern literary student. Yeah, we see this interpretation in literature as well. It's a combination of empirical data, so the text, and the relative interpretation. What you think of the text, but you have to base it off of that. So, the end.